Today's topic is energy evolution with an action plan for the City of Ottawa. Energy evolution is the action plan for how the City of Ottawa will meet the targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the community by 100% by 2050 and from the City of Ottawa operations by 100% by 2040. Its vision is to transform Ottawa into a thriving city powered by clean, renewable energy. The presentation today is going to have two Q&A sections. Please send your questions to the chat. And I will now introduce our speaker, Mr. Mike Fletcher. Mike grew up in an environmentally conscious household in Guelph in the 70s and 80s and attended Guelph University. Mike had an industrial background prior to joining the City of Ottawa in 2013. At the City of Ottawa, Mike worked in an energy management and conservation group prior to joining the planning department to work on the city's planning community energy transition plan, energy evolution. This fall, Mike was delighted when energy evolution was passed unanimously by the City of Ottawa Council. Mike, thank you for being here today, and I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Siobhan. When we were just chatting before we got the meeting going this morning, I mentioned, I've done the presentation quite a few times. This is the first time I presented since it was unanimously approved by City Council. And that's a great thing. And I think First U congregation deserves to have the first presentation after we got through council, because members of this congregation attended public meetings, attended interactive public meetings where they gave depositions, and the church as a whole, through the executive committee, sent a letter of support for energy evolution before the council meeting in October. So that was wonderful support, and every little bit helps. I think arguably it made the difference. All the support from the community, including First U, made the difference between the plan passing unanimously and possibly not passing unanimously. So I like to think that First U helped get the thing, get our plan over the line. So that's great. With that, you should be seeing me share the screen. And I'll just try and make this nice and big. So I'll talk about the city, meaning mostly the municipality to begin with, and climate change. Where our emissions come from, we have a good handle on that in the city. The history of getting to have an energy plan, so having energy evolution, what we have to do, what it's going to cost, and what the next 5 years look like. As Lee mentioned, I'll stop kind of in the middle just for a couple questions. There's a lot in this presentation. I've always found if I just hammer through the whole thing one time around without a little pause, it gets a little hard. So anyway, my pleasure to do that roughly in the middle of the talk in maybe a quarter of an hour. So just to start with just a little bit of a background of just kind of a civics lesson here on how we're organized in the planning department. We have a climate change master plan that considers both adaptation, so there's climate change coming whether we like it or not, and what are we going to do about that? So that's kind of the group on the right. And the group on the left is mitigation. We don't want any more climate change, or we want as little more as possible. And this is how we manage that. And so I work in that right-hand box, although I like to talk to other boxes. And the mitigation plan, I look at that box that's outlined in red, which is energy evolution itself. But to begin with, I'll talk a little bit about where emissions come from. So this looks at both the corporation, so our city government, and the community. The community includes the emissions from the city's operations, which are less than 5% of the community's emissions. And like big picture in the community, we can see half our emissions come out of buildings and half come out of transportation. There's a bit from waste, and there's a bit from agriculture. Ottawa's got a large rural area, so there's some emissions that come from land use in agriculture. The corporation is more getting emissions kind of from mobility. So the transit fleet, municipal fleet, police fleet are where a lot of that comes from. There's some facilities we have to heat, and there's more than the community sharing waste, of course, because we manage the waste, whether it's wastewater or a lot of the solid waste in the city. And then looking at that by fuel, our biggest source of emissions is natural gas. And you can kind of see that if you add the propane and the heating oil to the natural gas and assume a little bit of electricity heats buildings, about half our emissions come from heating buildings. And the balance is made up mostly by transportation items. And then if you look at the city side over to the right, the corporate, we're over 60% of that being diesel. And you think about what the city does, it runs transit buses that are diesel for now, plows a lot of snow using diesel in the winter. So those are kind of the big things. The emissions are now getting updated. The inventory on emissions are now getting updated every year, which I think is a great thing. The community pushed for that a little bit, and councillors agreed. And I think you don't make progress on things without measuring how you're doing, obviously. And before that, it had been more like 5 years, every 5 years, looking at emissions. So that's the background. That's what we have to work against and work to improve. So this is just kind of a little bit of the history of how we got to October 28th and the city having a plan. So 5 years ago, city staff were directed to develop a renewable energy strategy. Council had just passed a motion saying that the community would drop its emissions by 80% by 2050. And those kind of municipal council motions were kind of becoming boilerplate across Canada. And they were pushed a little bit by the feds, actually, to get FCM money, Federation of Canadian Municipality money, for instance. It was getting hard to do so without the city having a climate target. It's interesting that back then, some of the councillors started commenting that, although they put up their hand and voted for an 80% reduction target, there's a lot of comments that, well, we have no idea how we get there. We think this is motherhood and apple pie, but at some point we're going to have to know how we do it, which was a fair comment. And that led to all the work you see in here that led up to energy evolution getting passed. So the work was broken up into phases, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So it's a lot of looking at how we could reduce energy demand, switch to forms of energy that don't have emissions. It took a lot of study. And along the way, in 2019, Council declared a climate emergency. And a little bit after the climate emergency, there was some clarification, and the greenhouse gas target switched from being an 80% reduction to a 100% reduction, because that's in line with the current science. And it also was told to follow a budget that would entail Ottawa doing its part to avoid more than 1.5 degrees of global heating. So that caused us to change course a little bit. Everything was working towards an 80% reduction, and all of a sudden it switched to 100.
Dick?
And yeah, it's good. Yes.
Do you know quickly how you can increase the volume in this thing?
What, the tablet?
Yeah, all of a sudden.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like I was saying, we had a change there, and there was quite a bit of rework from that. Earlier in 2020, we started putting parts of the plan in front of council. So once we got a model together that showed everything we have to do to hit zero emissions and respect less than 1.5 degrees of heating, we had that go through council. So it was read into a council meeting. We knew the target then. And we knew all the actions, although they weren't detailed very much, we kind of knew them. So we more or less had the roadmap. And then the rest of the year was some more public consultation and doing work to describe all the actions we're going to do. So, and that got us to where we are now with a plan passed. I should mention here too, some actions came out in 2017 of things we said we'd start working on now. So some of those have been done. So there's already, even though we didn't have a complete plan done, we knew some things were obvious. Oh, sorry. We knew some things were obvious need to do's, and we got on them. Nothing's complete without a nice little graphic that kind of visually displays everything you want to see. And this was done like in 2015. It still kind of holds. It works with the model, actually. You see in here the things we need to do. I'll just take a minute now and I'll just describe kind of the process to getting to a plan. So for all that time in there, from about 2016 to, let's say, the end of 2019, we were doing a lot of studying and a lot of work with consultants. So we went through and we did what was called the pathway process. So in a pathway process, we look at any place we could make zero emission energy and study it and decide how much of it we can do. And we consider anywhere we use energy and figure out how we can use less. And also we figure out how we can, maybe do some fuel switching. So we have all that natural gas. How do we switch that over to heat pumps and electricity, for instance? So we studied each of these in pathways and had targeted technical meetings with members of the community. So that's kind of the first step in the process. So it's study and consult. And then we looked at all those actions and integrated them and produced a model. So the thing on the left, I'll get to in the next, on the right, excuse me, I'll get to in the next slide is the model. Integrating is what we got a consultant to help us do. The consultant looked at how far we could get in each of the pathways. So we could install so much solar. We could install so much wind. We could improve buildings X amount. And the work of a consultant was to draw on all those possible improvements and kind of integrate them in a way that got all the emissions reductions we want. And the integration is important, and it's very detailed work. The model is, I helped with the modeling. I consider the model a thing of beauty. The model integrates the fact that all actions influence most other actions. So, for example, we want to encourage active transportation. So why do we want to encourage active transportation? Well, because we get people out of their cars and they get from A to B, maybe riding a bicycle or walking. However, it also increases the use of public transit. So if people can easily walk or ride to an OC Transpo station, then transit use increases. So the fact that it's integrated is important, because if somebody comes along and says, putting that walking path or pedestrian bridge in costs a lot of money, I don't think it does very much to increase active transportation. Well, the answer is this is integrated and kind of holistic. So if you don't put the pedestrian bridge in, it's not only that fewer people walk, it's fewer people walk and catch a bus. And now more people are driving. So, and I could go on ad infinitum giving examples of how all the actions are integrated to get to the results. And a shout out for municipal energy planning is we have the only integrated models. Other organizations, other levels of government, almost universally talk about how to get some emissions reductions. None of them have an integrated plan. Municipalities in Canada Ottawa now joins Toronto, Edmonton, and Halifax, having fully integrated plans of how to get from where we are with emissions to where we need to be. So when Energy Evolution went to full council on October 28th, the chair of the Environment Committee, Councillor Moffat, said, look, if the other governments want to know how to battle climate change, just support our plans. They're really good. And he's dead right. And I could give examples of how other levels of government notionally have ideas on how to reduce emissions, but they're not integrated. And for anybody who works on an integrated plan, it's obvious they're not integrated. So that's a great thing we've done. And we should be proud that we have this plan. So just to relate this little bit on the right here, this model I talk about, here's a bigger shot of it. You can think of the top left here is now, and the top right is where we need to go. Well, excuse me, the bottom right is where we need to go. And these are where we get reductions from the different sectors where we have emissions now. And in the model, this is parsed out a lot more. So electricity has wind and solar and storage and conservation, and transportation has transportation or transformation of the city fleet to zero emission commercial vehicles, personal electric vehicles, switching to using transit, active transportation. So this is a lot subdivided. We'll never be able to see it on a presentation, but it's kind of the big bucket. And, in here, the comment when everybody sees the plan and the list of everything to do is how tough it is. And that's true. We've really waited too long to tackle climate change, and that becomes painfully obvious when you do a model like this. Tough things, I could go through them off the top of my head. Electricity, the model shows we need a lot of wind. So we need the equivalent of about 1,000 wind turbines. They wouldn't fit in Ottawa, for one thing. So that's got to be figured out. There would have to be kind of a regional supply that gets us enough electricity. Transportation, we don't know what will happen with commercial fleets like heavy trucks. The city can only directly control about 5% of what we need to do in this model. We can influence about half, and the rest is really, it's beyond us. Whether the world develops commercial trucks that are zero emission is kind of out of the City of Ottawa's hands. As it comes along, we can try and encourage it. We're encouraging use of transit and active transportation, but we can't demand it. We're encouraging people to use EVs by putting in some electric vehicles, by putting in some charging, but we can't force people to buy EVs. So those would be examples in transportation. In waste, the tough one in waste is that all our organic waste has to become renewable natural gas. It has to be recovered. The gas taken off it is a source of renewable fuel, and we have to use it. Right now, about half of our organic waste in Ottawa gets captured through the green bins and other systems that capture the organic waste. The model calls for 98% of organic material to be captured and turned into renewable fuel in 3 years. So there's another example of something that's really tough. Want something you can do to help on climate change? If you live on the Ottawa side, make sure you use your green bin if you have access to one. Existing buildings, so combination there of really improving how much heating is required for a building. So we need to reduce the amount of heat demand in a building in Ottawa, on average, by about 60 to 70%, depending on the building type. And then we need to switch that heating to a non-carbon source. So heat pumps or district energy type systems that don't have any, any fossil fuel used to deliver the heat. New buildings is interesting. We think by about 2030, building code will get us close to where we need to be. We don't think this one's too tough. We just need to follow a standard Toronto has put in place to encourage improved buildings, new buildings getting built, and we think we can meet this one not without too much difficulty. And this is just how the targets translate in terms of targets for the community, how much we have to reduce by what dates. And we have to follow a schedule like this because we're working on a carbon budget. If we don't do anything till close to 2050, we'll put so much CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the air, we won't be respecting a 1.5 degree global heating limit. So we have to follow this schedule. So when you hear about plans that kick actions down the road, just remember they don't cut it because CO2 is a pollutant, it stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So that's really not practical. And this is the last slide I'll do before I just pause for just a couple of questions. There are actually two models in the work we did. One is kind of business as planned, and it assumes we don't do too much, but doesn't assume we do nothing. It assumes kind of average improvements from the building code getting better, gas mileage of vehicles getting a bit better with a bit of nudging by the federal government, the climate getting warmer, so we have to heat the buildings a bit less. But it doesn't improve things because during this period, Ottawa's population increases by just under 30%. So that's why small incremental improvements in the context of the population and people coming to Ottawa accomplish nothing. It takes this plan, the blue line of the 100% scenario, with really audacious changes to get us there. So that's the modeling end. Oh, this before I take a couple questions, this is the top 5. So number 1 is electrifying personal vehicles. Number 2 is retrofitting residential buildings. I mentioned about all the diversion we need to do of organic material to make renewable natural gas. 4 is retrofitting commercial buildings. And the commercial fleet is number 5. So heavier vehicles becoming zero emission. So yeah, and I'll just pause there. I've been watching chat. Siobhan, are there any questions popping up or keep going?
There's a couple of questions. One from Eva, one from Maury. Would you like me to read them out to you? They're sure. In your chat if you would like to read them. So from Eva, she says, rather than wind turbines, is there a possibility of Ottawa purchasing electricity from Quebec's hydroelectric system? So
Ottawa can't purchase power directly from Quebec. The province can buy power from Quebec. 1, Ottawa is not allowed to, and 2, it's not technically feasible to string wires, low voltage wires between Ontario and Quebec. So the city really couldn't do it. The power in Quebec has different phase angulation and is not synchronized at 60 hertz with our grid and never will be. So unfortunately not. It's a good idea provincially, and there's a push coming to do it, and it's something we should get behind, but it can't be done at the local level. And I'm sorry, I forgot Maury's question.
So he's asking, what are some of the specific ways, aside from electric LRT, plan to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from OC Transpo?
Oh, okay. So OC Transpo, the next thing it would need to do would be to go to a zero emission bus fleet. And once it gets to a zero emission bus fleet and having the LRT be all zero emission, they're basically there. I mean, they have a few fleet vehicles like white vans and supervisors' cars and stuff like that. But those are the big things. All right.
Do you want to take another question?
Okay.
Hydro isn't mentioned so far. Is that because it's not very environmentally friendly?
So hydro isn't mentioned because this is a community plan. We mostly stick to generation inside Ottawa, including rural Ottawa, and there just isn't that much available. There's a little bit coming with the last development at Shortterm, and there's a redevelopment of Rideau Falls that'll, I don't know, give us a megawatt or something like that. And there's been talk about a few other places like Watson's Mills could make a bit of power, but there just isn't much. So that's the short of it. Okay, cognizant of time, I'll push on with the plan getting through City Council. As we proposed it to City Council, we also said what our short-term actions will be. And this is kind of a list. I won't get into too much detail on the list, but just to let people know that it's here. So this is a list of things that when we went to City Council a few weeks ago, were kind of like 3-page plans. So just quick 3-page plans on these things with some targets in them, which is good, on how to get started. I think from this, what will come out of a lot of these things will be charters to start work, charters in terms of reference documents to start work, and then we start executing. And some executing's been starting. So, for example, on this list, the high performance building standard, we were developing, the high performance building standard, we were developing that one before we went to committee and council. And that one's gone through public consultation. So that one will be ready to roll fairly soon. Similarly, the green building policy has started. Actions out of personal electric vehicle electrification strategy have started. We're putting in some charging around the city. So that's rolling. And the renewable natural gas strategy, there's a study going on at the city's wastewater treatment plant about getting more renewable natural gas out of the wastewater treatment plant. So I won't go into all of them, considering the time. And this is an example of things we'll do under some of those 5-year plans. So in buildings, we need to retrofit 17% of existing residential buildings. So in those previous few slides, there was an action called Residential Building Retrofit Accelerator Program. And that's the big thing we have to do out of it. And the next one is for commercial buildings, and we've got to renovate a heck of a lot of those now. Like I was saying earlier, hitting all the targets in the plan is really tough. And it's, renovating 17% of the houses in 5 years. That's audacious, really. And it's going to be very hard to hit. And we know it, but nothing else works with the plan. The plan was always to do what fits with the emissions, not to cop out and start saying, okay, well, yeah, that looks too tough. Let's not say that. We never did that because that would completely destroy the integrity of looking at what we need to do, right? So that's why these things are tough. So personal electric vehicle electrification strategy, 7% of personal vehicles are EVs in 2025. That'll mean by around 2025, we'll need to have a fairly good proportion of sales be electric vehicles. So yeah, and waste, this one, eliminate organics from landfill. We're allowed to put 2% in the landfill and that's it. And that needs to start in 2023. So all pretty tough. That's how it is. I mean, a good climate plan would have started in 1980, but it's not 1980. What can I tell you? We also did a lot of work on looking at a cost model. And some of you know Janice Ashworth, who was previously the leader at the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op, and she worked more on the cost side. I worked more on the emission side of the model, and she did great work on the cost side. So the financial analysis is done community-wide. So, and this is important because a lot of the money for the transition can come from all over the place, not the city. Most of it doesn't come from the city over the 30-year period, and the city wouldn't be able to afford it. And the model looks at both the cost and the potential savings. The estimates are very high level. We've already had, people who work in different fields start to bug us about how accurate our cost model is, and we say, hey, this is like plus or minus 30% here. This is high level. We're sure we'll be wrong by some percentage. The point is, directionally, we know what we have to do. And as I was saying, I think before we got going to some people, there's no commitment anywhere in this plan. The plan's there. We know what we got to do, but keeping people committed to it will be an ongoing work. And this is what the plan tells us. So the capital investment, and I'll just do undiscounted because present value is a bit airy-fairy for a lot of people, requires across the community 57 billion investment over 30 years. So that's the municipal government and everybody else who lives here. That's started. I mean, everybody who pays more for an electric vehicle than a gas car has started to do what's on this top line at 57 billion. So that's across the community. The good news from this is it pays back. So at the end of this, we're money in pocket. The bad news is there's a lot of upfront investment to get there. So no pain, no gain. And this graph kind of tells you that. So there's zero over here on the left on the graph. And so that's kind of cost neutrality. And above the line is cost, below the line is returns. So an example of cost and returns could be an electric OC Transpo bus. It costs hundreds of thousands more money, and it costs very little to operate. So initially, there's cost and there's investment, and then it starts to pay back. And then around 2032, all the investing we do in the community, so switching to zero emission fleets, improving the buildings so they don't cost so much to heat, in addition to having lower emissions, starts to pay back for us. So this is, if we follow this planning scenario, this is when things get good and we start to see returns. What's a little tough in the area in about the next 10 years is a lot of the investment required in the first 10 years needs to come from the city. So it'll be things like electrification of transit and getting solid waste and wastewater to work the way we need them to work to help reduce emissions. So the city's going to have to figure that out. So that's the tough part. And this is just the breakdown by sector, and shows the money going in. Buildings are still the toughest thing, as you can see. We don't get a positive net return, but everything else does give something in the way of a positive net return. A thing that came up during the discussion was we had this pandemic happen, and how's that going to affect things? It didn't affect our work too much. We're planners. I mean, we got the plan done. There has been a small emission decline in greenhouse gas emissions across the city due to the pandemic. And I think anybody who drives a car around can see it. It's because of less transportation demand. I think it's kind of an open question how much transportation demand will be depressed after the pandemic is over, but it's not significant. So, you know, it's like about 5%. So still 95% left to do. But we'll keep monitoring the trends. I think the Transportation Master Plan, which incidentally is starting to be done now, will be the people that have to think the most about this. Because if, you know, after the pandemic, if a good hunk of people continue to work from home, you know, I could put my hand up for that. I think, you know, some of the drop in transportation demand could be permanent. So, like everyone who's anyone now, we have a web page, so you can look us up and go on there. We're starting to work social media a bit. We have a communications person now who is helping us. And then some other departments help us. The city's general communications is often putting things on Facebook and Twitter. And Ottawa Public Health, I'll give a shout out to them, operate the largest social media public health network in North America. They have 100,000 followers across their media platforms, and have actually they've supported energy evolution because well, for obvious reasons. So overheating the city is a public health concern. We don't talk too much about just standard air pollution from things like vehicles and heating buildings, but it's there. You know, that'll be one of the benefits of energy evolution, one of the non-emissions or financial benefits. And other ones include a quieter city when there's no engines revving. That's been looked to in studies. So public health has been great in helping to champion this. So our plan, we'll continue to work with internal and external stakeholders. Sorry, this was from a presentation. It doesn't sound very folksy. But the second bullet kind of says it more importantly is advocacy. So we have a list of advocacy. We need the feds to do this. We need the province to do this. And we're starting to work that advocacy list now. Because as I said, we only directly control about 5% of what we need to do, and we need to do a lot of influencing. I think our big lever in being able to influence is that governments that are serious about tackling climate change at other levels realize that municipalities are a good partner for doing it. So we hope that what we ask for when we do advocacy will get listened to. At the city, we'll look at having a climate lens, and we're having governance discussions about how this whole initiative keeps rolling, because it's involved the community a lot to get here, and we need to think about that. Governance, up till now, you would say, was done by the city to make the plan, but to keep the community involved and keep it rolling, it needs a governance structure that involves the city, involves the community. And then we'll do a lot of work just working on the plans. And I should also mention we'll redo the model in about 5 years. We'll keep doing the emissions forecast every year. And the next model will probably be a little bit more sophisticated and look for maybe more emissions than we went after the first time. So it'll be a bit more involved, but yeah, that's kind of the plan going forward. And if you want to send us an email, it goes there and gets divvied out. Who knows? If you send an email to Energy Evolution, it might be me typing back. So yeah. Anyway, that's it. Thanks a lot, everyone, and glad to take your questions now.
One question is, why is the city building highways?
Well, city, I think the only highway the city builds is 174, not the Queensway. And why do they do it? I don't have a good answer for that. Like, it's not supported by the plan. So the plan doesn't tell the city to expand highways or put lanes on arterial roads. Yeah, I think that's an open question. It would be an example of you know, how we can use the plan to encourage the right action.
Another question, how are marginalized people considered?
So we have considered equity and inclusion in the plan. And that comes down to, and it even comes down to the action plans, the 5-year plans we have. I could give an example in electric vehicles. We've noticed that about a third of the public electric vehicle chargers that have been installed are in Canada North, because that's where there's people who buy those vehicles. But we have talked to the Electric Vehicle Council in Ottawa, and they've said, you know, in a few years, it won't just be the well-heeled people buying electric vehicles. There'll be used ones on the market. It could be low-income people buying them and needing them to get to a job somewhere. What are you going to do about that? So we're considering how we can have electric vehicle chargers in parts of the city that are obviously underserved. And you could imagine 10 years from now, if EVs take off the way the plan calls for, you know, a person in a lower income neighborhood in the city might have trouble with a gas car because there'd be fewer service stations. And now trying to use that to get to a job, for instance, could be tougher. So it's just one example of how it goes into the thinking. But there is a whole part of the report is called Co-Benefits, which considers equity and inclusion.
This isn't a question, it's a comment. The poisonous lithium used to produce electric car is a problem. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think lithium, the compound's lithium.
Lithium?
Yeah. I don't know specifically how toxic it is. I know there's issues of how it's mined somewhat unethically. Well, quite unethically in some places. And I think that, you know, overall, we will run into situations where we have issues like that. But I can't help but notice that this only seems to come up from some quarters when it's proposed to use lithium to help with an energy transition. Nobody seemed to complain when it was just for our laptops, or at least not very much. So I smell a bit of something political in complaints like this. I think the complaints are legitimate. But I'll say that some of the technologies we consider using to help with the energy transition are in their infancy, and will definitely get better. You know, like electric vehicles have been around at commercial scale for less than 10 years, internal combustion engines for almost 100. So I think you have to cut things some slack to make some headway. So yeah, there are issues that we'll need to address on things like that going forward, for sure.
And this is about new housing build standards. Are the standards much higher than they used to be?
So the standards have been getting higher over the years. As we look at the city's stock of buildings, probably the best improvement in the building code was around 1984. That's where we really, when we look at how much energy buildings use, that was kind of a seminal year for a big drop. After that, it's been kind of slow. We don't rely on building code too much because it tends to be kind of a trailing initiative. You know, a bunch of things get proposed, and people who build buildings for a living get to have a lot of input and tend to be kind of conservative as far as making changes and improvements. So that's why the city is developing a building standard that'll go beyond the building code at least to 2030. And without that, we don't hit our target.
All right. I'm trying to read questions out, giving everyone a chance. So I'm going to skip down a couple. How does the inability for a municipal government to run a deficit hinder ability to make upfront investments?
Municipal government can't run an operating deficit, but we can borrow money for capital projects. So I think I would say that the regulatory limits on municipalities in Ontario are not a huge impediment. I think the bigger impediment is maybe local policy about how much debt we can take on, which is kind of independent of how the province limits what we can do. And the other thing would be just the amount we need to do in the first 10 years. It's going to be hard for the city to capitalize its share of all those changes. So those are kind of the two impediments. The operating budget, yeah, we can't run a deficit, that's quite right. But most of what we do have to do are capital investments anyway, so it's the capital budget. So we're not too hamstrung. It's not maybe as bad as people think if they just know about the limits on the operating deficit or not having one in operating.
And Mary Hegan would like to ask you a question.
Okay.
Mike, can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead. I can't hear anything.
Mary, you're muted.
Am I muted now?
All good.
Go ahead.
No. Okay. Okay, I'll try again. Mike, I love your presentation and the summary of all the evolution documents that I'm trying to wade through. How do we get a copy of your set of slides that you used this morning? I thought it was a great summary.
So I'm going to offer the slides. I'd make them available through the presentation. So that's as far as I know it. I don't know, Margaret or Lee or somebody, can you describe how the slides could be available?
I think if people want to share their email address in the chat, I'm happy to forward the presentation on to folks who wanted it. Mike, assuming it's public and we can share it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah.
This will be posted, will it not? The whole recording.
Yeah, we'll post the recording, and then also if people want the slide deck as the PowerPoint.
Okay, it's separate.
Yeah, send me an email or just put your email in the chat, and I'll capture the emails of people who want the presentation, and we'll send it along.
We can also put the slide presentation on the climate.
Right.
You can just download it yourself. Mike, great presentation.
Thank you.
Another question?
Mary's muted again, I think. Unmute, Mary.
Okay.
There, good.
All right. Okay. How closely is your evolution team working with writing the new official plan? Some of us feel like your whole plan and approach is good, but if we approve a new official plan that is sprawling and it just has some major counter incentives to do things not as you have suggested. How is that all being balanced, and how well do you think we're doing of integrating your plan into what's being written into the new official plan?
So a lot of the work on this plan was done concurrently with the official plan, and one of the planners working on the official plan was in the team working on energy evolution. So although there was quite a controversy about expanding the urban boundary earlier in the year, many other aspects of the plan, in fact, all of them that I can think of, have gone the way that we would like in terms of supporting the plan. So that means renewable energy is generally permitted use in land zoning is a big one. Supporting the high performance development standard is reflected in the plan. Supporting district energy is reflected in the plan. The planner really, whenever there was language in the plan, she was working with the official plan, was working with the team on energy evolution to make sure the wording was the way we wanted it. So, notwithstanding the controversy about the urban boundary, which was a bit beyond what we could control, notwithstanding that, I think it's pretty solid. And I'll say that about the transportation plan too. So this is pretty well meshed with one of the possible plans that will be pursued on the transportation master plan. The transportation master plan is not as far along, so syncing that was a little harder, but it's, let's call it reasonably well synced at this stage.
Just one final question. The last time I think we've met, which was a few years ago, was getting advice from you on micro hydro, especially being produced within the city of Ottawa, like the Burris Rapids initiative. I don't see that anywhere in this document at the moment. So I just wanted to know, from getting renewable energy from hydro, where the specifics are at, especially for the next 5 years.
So yeah, that's right. You certainly didn't see it today, Mary. However, it's in one of the supporting documents to have a certain amount of hydro development. As I said during the presentation, there isn't a lot because there aren't a lot of opportunities. But in phase one, the Burris Rapids development, for example, is mentioned as something we need to do. Where we're stopped, and I've talked to one of the people at Burris Rapids about that, Bob, I've talked to Bob about that at Burris Rapids, is we need a market access framework from the province. And we don't have that yet. So that's where it stopped. We're appealing to the province to give us that, but until that happens, I don't see a way forward. If the small production can't access the market, it's a complete block. That's what we need.
Okay, so this is a good question to end on. How can Unitarians join and support community co-ops to achieve these goals?
So there's a couple community co-ops. Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative and CoEnergy are a couple of them. Those are the two I know of. Really just look them up and send them a line to join them. And I don't think you have to put a lot of capital in to become a member, and do that. And then I would say, if you join them, you can ask them about what they need from the province to help them thrive, because they definitely have a list. So join them, and then do a little bit of influencing work, or join their influencing work to help them do more development.
All right, Mike, thank you for helping us to understand some more about the important and ambitious goals in Ottawa's energy evolution. Okay, so please join us next Sunday at 9 a.m. for a presentation about Ancora, an organization that provides a supportive community to adults living with mental illness. Ancora's Executive Director, Dr. Chris Jones, will speak about the organization and how it moves forward in providing its residents with a nurturing environment that is free of stigma. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day and see you next time. Thank you.